Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Lamb, the Director of Operations at Goodwin-Niering Center for the Environment. I also teach ES 100 C. See some wonderful familiar faces here. We have a lot of our Goodwin-Niering fellows here. I won't embarrass anyone, and a lot of our wonderful scholars in the center. But it's with great pleasure that I introduce you tonight to our Linda Lear lecture. And we have a fabulous guest speaker for you tonight. If you have yet to experience Professor Turner's class, any of his classes that he teaches, I highly recommend him. He is our, actually, I'm going to wait to introduce him in a second. I just want to give a couple acknowledgements. The center and this lecture wouldn't be possible without some of my amazing colleagues. One of is Professor Julia Flagg, our senior fellow. But another is hiding in the back is Kelly Wagner, our assistant director. Wave hi to Kelly. Kelly makes sure every event is wonderful and perfect. So this will also be live streamed. So if some of your friends can't make it today, you can send them the link. It's on social media. So thank you, Kelly. A couple things. It's a Lear lecture, which is very appropriate because if you've been to the Lear collection, you'll know that there'll be some parallels between what Linda Lear's passion is and what Professor Turner will be talking about tonight. It's also, this event is co-sponsored very graciously by the ES department, the philosophy department, and the AI at Con initiative. So it's pretty exciting, a great topic. So back to Derek Turner. Derek is our Karla Heurich Harrison 28 director of the Goodwin-Niering Center for the Environment. He's also in the philosophy department as well, and he's also an environmental studies affiliate. You don't want me to go on and on about how great Derek is, but if you've ever taken any of his courses or had a conversation with him, you know he's one of the most kind, considerate, thoughtful, and brilliant people you ever meet, but he's also very modest. But I think you'll see today that even in this quick presentation, he just said, oh, you know, this semester you could throw together a talk on AI in the environment. I think you'll just see and really enjoy his perspective. And if it's anything like my past experience with him, it'll leave you having more questions than answers in true philosopher style. So join me in welcoming Professor Derek Turner for environmental discussion and generative AI.
Thank you, Jen, for that super nice intro. Thanks, everybody. It's really nice to see everyone here. I'm a little anxious about the live streaming and a little anxious about being a little bit over my head on this topic, but here we go. I'll just try to philosophize about AI to see how it goes. I wanted to start with this image. I actually found this on so Google has a photo library online that they just make available for everyone. This is just an image of one of their data centers. And the phrase, the Silicon Prairie, I didn't make that up. That's Google's own descriptor. And I don't know, this really struck me. I mean, I grew up in Central Illinois, and my hometown of Decatur is the pride of the prairie. Like, that's not a prairie. That's a lawn with some maybe Photoshop deer. I don't quite know what's going on with this image, but this is a data center in Council Bluffs, Iowa. That's one place. I should mention, though, this is also an older data center that goes back to, I think, 2007. So this is not, itself something that's kind of built for AI. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start by rehearsing the story of Rachel Carson and the eventual ending of DET, which I just think is just it's central to environmentalism in the U.S. Just really important, kind of narrative. And then I'll just give a really rough overview of some of the environmental risks associated with AI, and then I'm going to do some philosophy and contrast 3 different views about technological innovation. And then I'll draw a conclusion that's sort of inspired by Rachel Carson. So the perspective of the talk is going to be very Carsonian. Okay, just to start with a bit of history, you may be familiar with this. Rachel Carson's masterpiece in 1962, Silent Spring, which is all about synthetic chemical pesticides and their environmental and human health impacts. I first learned about Carson when I was a little kid, actually collecting stamps. I was like really stamp collecting, and I had that one in my collection. I was like, oh, who's Rachel Carson? It's also pretty, I was just thinking, getting right to that, it's like 19 years from her book to showing up on a postage stamp. That's pretty we do have, I'm also kind of inspired by the work of Linda Lear, who is a Connecticut College alumna from class of 1962, former trustee of the college, a wonderful scholar and author of the definitive biography of Rachel Carson, which I recommend to everybody. I've been relying quite a bit on Linda's work and really kind of hoping to honor Linda Lear a little bit with this talk. Okay, so in the 50s, when Rachel Carson gets interested and really starts looking at chemical pesticides, there's a ton of enthusiasm for these new chemical pesticides, of which DDT is just one example. And I put an ad here just to kind of give you a sense for kind of what the world was like at this time. This is an ad for DDT-soaked wallpaper for your kids' bedrooms to kind of keep the bugs off of your little kids, right? This is just the kind of stuff they're putting, they were really marketing DDT and other pesticides really heavily in this ad. A lot of enthusiasm. This is the way of the future, chemical pesticides. So there was the U.S. military was using DDT in powdered form during World War II for delousing and insect control. And you see that in that image. In the 50s, by the time you get into the 50s, there's a lot of aerial spraying going on. This is a photograph of aerial DDT spraying in Idaho. One interesting detail is the powdered form of DDT that they were using on soldiers was not readily absorbed by the body. And so a lot of people were like, oh, we're dousing everybody with DDT right and left. It seems perfectly safe, right? When you mix it with oil, as they did in aerial spraying, it's a different story. It actually has much, it actually can be absorbed by organisms. So Carson intervenes in it. She gets interested in the 50s. She has acquaintances on Long Island who are dealing with like aerial spraying issues in their areas. She gets kind of wrapped up in this. She does a ton of research and publishes Silent Spring in '62. And going back and rereading the book to get ready for this talk, I'm kind of blown away by it. Like, it's really an incredible book. She's ahead of her time on a bunch of issues. She points out that insecticides like DDT are indiscriminate. They don't kill only the target species, they kill everything. She focuses on bioaccumulation. DDT kills the bugs, and fish eat the bugs, birds eat the fish, and on and on. She focuses on carcinogenesis and early evidence that some of these pesticides might be carcinogens. And of course, Carson herself was struggling with cancer while writing the book and died very shortly after the book was published. She tragically died quite young. She was looking at evidence that aerial spraying is harmful to birds and small mammals. She was also, I think, way ahead of her time on the topic of pesticide resistance. This kind of blew me away. By the time she writes Silent Spring in '62, she's already noticing that DDT is not working very well anymore because some of the target species are evolving resistance. So she's right on top of that issue. And she notices, she does write a bit about observed declines in some bird populations, specifically bald eagles, which turns out to be a really important issue. There's other people after her who do more work on that, but she's right there on that issue as well. Okay, so here's the timeline. There's a chemist in Switzerland, Paul Hermann Müller, who is the one who first figures out in 1939 that DDT works well as an insecticide. The chemical itself had been synthesized in the late 19th century, much earlier, but Müller wins a Nobel Prize in 1948 for his work to identify good chemical insecticides. The 50s and 60s is sort of the heyday of DDT use. Carson intervenes with her book in 1962 And then subsequently, through the 60s into the early 70s, other researchers really start to document the phenomenon of eggshell thinning in populations like bald eagles and peregrine falcons, condors. So, and they do more work to attribute that to pesticides, including DDT. So that's a major issue at the time, which leads famously to the banning of DDT in the US for agricultural use in 1972. Okay. Sort of a silly side note, I was born in 74, right after this happened, and my parents accidentally gave me the initials DDT. I recently asked my mom about this, and she's like, yeah, it was a total accident. And I have a beloved uncle, my mom's oldest brother, who used to call me bug dust when I was a little kid. And I think he was just trolling my parents. He was like, kind of making fun of that. Okay. The United States actually continued to export DDT to other parts of the world for quite a long time, even after banning it domestically in agriculture. But in the early 2000s, there's the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants does solidify a worldwide ban on DDT. Not quite, or I should say on DDT for agricultural uses. There's some exemptions for public health uses for like malaria control. There's a couple of countries that don't sign on to this ban, so that's worth keeping in mind. That's just a really quick review of the history. To look at a couple of passages, just to give you a sense of Carson's writing. So she says, it's not my contention that chemical insecticides must never be used. This is really, really interesting. Rachel Carson never calls for the banning of DDT. I think because we know what happens later, we often kind of read that back into it, and we kind of assume, oh, she must have been calling for the banning of DDT. No, she doesn't go there. She said, I do contend that we put poisonous and biologically potent chemicals into the hands of persons largely or wholly ignorant of their potential for harm. We subjected enormous numbers of people to contact with these poisons without their consent and often without their knowledge. This issue of informed consent shows up repeatedly in Carson's writing. This is going to be a really big issue for her. She says, I contend furthermore that we've allowed these chemicals to be used with little or no advanced investigation of their effect on soil, water, wildlife, and man himself. Future generations are unlikely to condone our lack of prudent concern for the integrity of the natural world that supports all life. This is another theme of her work. Again, she's not calling for a ban. What she objects to is the indiscriminate deployment of these chemical pesticides without prior research to actually, so that anyone has a clue like what's actually going on ecologically and in terms of human health. So this is a line from Carson that I found really powerful. She asked, have we fallen into a mesmerized state that makes us accept as inevitable that which is inferior or detrimental, as though having lost the will or the vision to demand that which is good? And she's kind of, you can see her here pushing back against the thought that, well, pesticides are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. It's inevitable. People are just going to be using them. And she's really, I think, challenging that pretty explicitly here. Okay. So that's just a super rough overview of the story of Carson and DDT. I'm now going to shift gears a little bit and provide an equally rough just kind of overview of some of the risks associated with generative AI. So I'm going to divide this into two pieces. There's the kind of much discussed issue of data centers and their potential contributions to climate change. I'm also kind of interested in the science fiction stuff, like low probability, speculative risks. By the way, ecobots are a thing. There are companies manufacturing ecobots to, this is a submersible drone chasing after lionfish. There's, some people are interested in, kind of using robots for landscape management and stuff like that. So I'm gonna divide the discussion here into those two parts. But first, a couple of qualifications. I don't pretend to be offering any kind of comprehensive assessment of costs and benefits associated with AI. Like, that's too huge. Like, I wouldn't even really know how to do that. I have a lot of intuitions about that, but like, that's just bigger than I can do. I'm really just going to focus pretty narrowly on a couple of the environmental issues. And I also just want to flag, AI has absolutely had some benefits. So this is not, we shouldn't be all negative here, especially in specific applications in the sciences, like the use of AI to sort of crack the problem of protein folding. Professor Zimmerman has written some interesting stuff about this, and this is a pretty big deal in biological science with possible applications for like drug development and stuff like this. So that needs to be said. One other kind of caveat, I think this third point I think is really important. I want to be careful about distinguishing between the AI we have now and the AI that's coming, because the sort of the analysis might be a little different. And the AI that's coming is, people are talking about artificial general intelligence in the next couple of years. Like, this is what we see in the next 2-3 years could actually be pretty rapidly and significantly advancing beyond what we have today. So this isn't exactly my field. I don't quite know how to assess this. I just want to kind of flag that there's a lot of uncertainty about this. Okay, so to start with the science fiction stuff. By the way, we rewatched the original Terminator film this weekend just to kind of get in their mindset. It's actually really interesting. I kind of so yeah, the worry is maybe AI raises the probability of global environmental catastrophe and extinction, maybe by a tiny amount. Right? I'm making numbers up here. I have no idea how to like assess what the probabilities would be. I'm truly just making things up. But for example, suppose that without AI, the probability of global environmental catastrophe over the next century is like 1 in a million or something like that. And suppose that with AI, the probability goes to 2 in a million or something. So like these are very low probability catastrophic scenarios we're talking about. And imagine, well, maybe AI just like makes that just a little bit more likely, right? The thought is, well, if the catastrophe is bad enough, even those very tiny incremental increases in risk might be things that we need to think really, really hard about. That's sort of the thought. To now shift gears a little bit and think about data centers and what's going on there. As I've done a bit to try to get my bearings here, it's actually kind of hard to really figure out exactly what the story is. I'm going to share with you today like my best understanding of things up to this point. But this is kind of a graph from the recent Department of Energy report from late last year. And you can see it shows the trend line of the percentage of total energy consumption in the US that's attributable to data centers, right? So this is only looking at the US, that's important. And as of 2023, it's like 4.4%, so pretty low. And this is all data centers, by the way. This is not just supporting AI. The projected increase, though, is going to end up by 2028 with data centers accounting for 6.7 to 12% of domestic electricity consumption in the US. That's just kind of the trend projection from the Department of Energy. And it looks like increasing demand for AI is like the main thing they're figuring into that trend projection. Globally, I want to offer this other thing too. This is a recent piece from Nature. I do want to stress, like, AI is not our biggest problem necessarily with respect to climate change. It's in the mix, but it's for perspective. I thought this this data representation was kind of interesting. This is a kind of assessment of global electricity demand through 2030, right? And you can kind of see, or kind of projected demand growth through 2030. And you can see data centers are in there. They're a piece of the puzzle. They're not as significant as, say, for example, like air conditioning. I think, you know, if we care about climate change, like increasing reliance on air conditioning is something we should be talking about. So, but data centers are not nothing either. So I just kind of offer that for a bit of perspective. This is, okay, a lot of people have the question, okay, how much energy usage really is involved in like an AI query or using AI to generate an image or something like that? It's so hard to figure out. I've tried to look at some sources on this. It's just, I just want to kind of stress it's very tough. This is one report from this AI from the Hugging Face, which this is included in this recent Nature news item that I was looking at. And they're looking at, okay, how much energy are you using if you like use AI to generate an image and then do that 1,000 times, right? So that's a lot. And it's sort of between, that's kind of the top line up there. Notice that's just the mean, the red dots are the means, right? They average a bunch of different AI systems, right? And it's sort of between the amount of energy to fully charge your smartphone and the amount of energy to run your laptop for 20 hours. So it's not nothing, but it's, well, anyway, I just offer that for, you know, a little bit of information on context. Okay. Another example that I've been thinking about a little bit, you know, their data center construction is a real issue. And there's a proposal on the table to build, I'm actually not really plugged in on the current state of play with this. This is from, I think this article is maybe last year, a little over a year ago, so I'm not super up to date here. But there's a proposal to build a data center in Waterford and plug into the nuclear plant. Now, that sounds good, right? Nuclear power is not contributing to climate change. The issue is that's 300 megawatts that's going from, or that would be, you know, if they proceeded with this, would be going from the nuclear plant to power the data center that's not supported in the general electrical grid. So just one more, you know, kind of set of numbers maybe for perspective. Okay. Also, there are plans afoot to build a ton more data centers. This is President Trump meeting, I think in the first week of his, maybe the first few days of his administration, with tech CEOs announcing the Stargate project to invest $500 billion over the next 4 years in construction of new data centers and infrastructure for data centers, right? So this kind of thing is all about building up infrastructure for AI. Okay. It's hard, like I said, I've been kind of emphasizing there's a ton of uncertainty. It's a little hard to figure out like what exactly the impacts are. One issue is, especially in the US, companies are not sharing much, so they're not making it real easy to figure out, okay, how much electricity usage are they really talking about? Another source of uncertainty is AI might be getting better. So, DeepSeek is this more recently released example where the technology is more efficient, actually. It seems like maybe it's actually going to use less electricity. This is a little bit above my pay grade. I don't know that much about this, but I just offer that as like another source of uncertainty. Another real uncertainty is we don't know exactly how to project demand. How much are people going to use it? I think that's a little difficult. Partly because it's up to us, right? It's up to choices that that we're making right now, as to kind of how to use the technology, whether to use it at all, and what ways to use it. One question that comes up, is like, oh, could AI help mitigate climate change? And there's different kinds of proposals that you see. One proposal that I've seen mentioned out there in the popular discussions, you could use AI to help reroute flight paths to minimize contrails. okay, that airplanes form. So contrails have a small net warming effect on the atmosphere. So if you can kind of route the planes through areas where they're less likely to form contrails, well, that might actually help just a little bit with climate change. This is just a thing I found on like a Google blog, right? So not an impartial source here, but kind of sharing some work on this. I don't really know what to make about this. I have a question, which is like, could we just like we know how to mitigate climate impacts of air travel. Like this, it's not that complicated. So I mean, maybe this would help, but I think we shouldn't, as we try to assess things like this, I don't think we should necessarily give ourselves a free pass on some other things that we know would help climate change. I'll put it that way. Okay, so I'm trying to like play it safe here and offer a sort of conservative assessment of the possible environmental risks associated with generative AI. It looks to me like increasing demand for AI is very probably going to make climate change worse by some margin in the near term. Okay? Now, that margin might be pretty small. Think about some of what I shared here. It might not be a huge negative impact with respect to climate change. But here's the thing, we're in a climate emergency right now. And even a small change in the wrong direction is, I think, a problem. So I offer that as like part of the picture here. And then don't forget the sci-fi scenarios. AI, I think, also may well be increasing the probability of global environmental catastrophe by some small increments. Who knows what that is, but I think that's what it's fair to say. One more thing we're at Kennedy College, we have a carbon neutrality pledge. I wanted to say a little bit about this. Our previous president, or kind of president before our previous president, Captain Bergeron, committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2030. And you might wonder, well, how does AI use or other, internet use kind of figure into this? And the short answer is that it doesn't. This falls under Scope 3 emissions. So these basically off-campus impacts that are not getting counted towards our carbon neutrality pledge. So Scope 3 emissions include emissions that are indirectly caused by campus operations. So this isn't really figured in the mix for our carbon neutrality pledge. So I just want to let that sit. We can come back and talk more about that. Okay, that's all set up. Not to get to some philosophy. I'm interested in contrasting three views about tech. Okay? There's an innocent until proven harmful view, a better safe than sorry view, and what I'm going to call a careful experiment view. So to start with the innocent until proven harmful view, where we treat technology as innocent until proven harmful, there's no pre-market safety testing. Companies can just introduce stuff. Okay? The burdens on consumers demonstrate harm. Right? If you feel like you've been harmed by some new technology, you can sue. Right? We use a tort law system to redress harms. There's no requirement of informed consent. Right? A nice example of this is like Teflon pans. Companies, there's no pre-market safety testing requirement for synthetic chemicals in like consumer products like Teflon pans. A book, I want to share a book recommendation. There's a book that opened my eyes about this stuff that I really think everyone should read. It's by a philosopher named Karla Heurich Harrison. It's called Legally Poison. This book totally freaked me out when I first read it. Here he is writing just a bit about PFAS chemicals. So perfluorinated products have been used for about 60 years in lubricants prints paper, textile coatings like Scotchgard, polishes packaging for foods, and foams, as well as fire retardants. They've been used in nonstick cookware, and rain-repellent clothes, and have well-recognized trade names like Scotchgard, Stainmaster, Teflon, and so on. Major perfluorinated substances have been found in more than 98% of the U.S. population older than 12. Right? We all have these chemical body burdens, and the one problem that Craner gets into at length here is we're all stuck like trying to figure out the health impacts of some of these things after people have already been using their Teflon pans, for years and years and years. So the research is very tough. Again, there's no pre-market safety testing at all for things like this. Now I want to reflect, do a little more philosophy here and ask, well, why would anybody think that this innocent until proven harmful stuff makes any sense at all? There's a view about technology. I want to kind of take a bit of a digression here. There's a view about technology that I think is really widely held, and that I want to challenge a little bit. And it's the idea that technology itself is ethically inert, that it's neither good nor bad per se, but the only question is how to distinguish permissible versus impermissible uses of it. Okay, so the only question, like you hear, like people might say stuff like this about AI. Oh well, it's not good or bad. It's just we just need to be careful about how we're using it. Okay? I think if you think that technology is ethically inert in this sense, it might be pretty tempting to say, well, yeah, it's innocent until proven harmful. We'll go ahead and use it, and maybe with some efforts to make sure that people don't misuse it. But I think these views kind of go together. But I want to challenge this, and I want to use a favorite example of banjo design. These are two virtuosic banjo players, Rhiannon Giddens and Pete Seeger. And if you look carefully, their instruments are different. Okay, so Rhiannon Giddens has a frailing scoop on her banjo. It's that cutout part right there. Seeger does not. Okay, and here's the thing: the presence or absence of a frailing scoop makes a difference to how you play. If you play with the old-time two-fingered claw hammer style, like I think Giddens is doing in that image, having that frailing scoop lets you move your right hand up the neck of the instrument, and so you play it differently. If you don't have a frailing scoop, that's harder to do, and you position your hand further down over the pot of the instrument. So the design of the instrument affects how you play it. That's the thought. Technology does stuff to us. Okay, it does stuff to us. There's so many. I'm trying to go with an easy example, but it's just we all know social media does stuff to us. All these technologies do stuff to us. Okay. So quick argument. Technology provides affordances that shape human behavior. What's true of the frailing scoop is true of technology in general. Human behavior is not ethically inert and subject to ethical assessment. So technology is not ethically inert. So for this reason, I'm a little skeptical about this ethical inertness. Okay. Suppose we forget about the innocent until proven harmful stuff. What other views of technology might we take? Well, one leading contender with a really rich tradition going back decades is the precautionary principle. Better safe than sorry. This does typically require pre-market safety testing, requires informed consent. The idea is to shift the burden for proving safety onto the corporations that will profit from deploying new technology. It's closely connected. This is a sort of a more technical thing off to one side, but it's closely connected with the maxi-min rule of rational decision making, which is that it's reasonable in general to choose the option with the least bad worst case scenario for a risk-averse principled decision making. An example of this is like the FDA drug approval process. So I think it's actually really interesting that in some areas of life, like we adopt a precautionary approach. Like if you want to sell a new drug to anybody, you've got to test it for safety and efficacy in this really rigorous way to get FDA approval. That's a precautionary approach that involves requiring informed consent and so on. And I just want to kind of highlight there are places where we do that, places where we don't. An important statement of the precautionary principle comes from this conference that took place in Wisconsin in the late 90s. When an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully understood. And I want to give a shout out. One of the first students in the Goodwin-Niering Center I ever got to work with was Lauren Hartzell-Nichols in the class of 03, and we worked together on the precautionary principle. And she went on to do a PhD in philosophy, and she's written the book, developing a version of the precautionary principle and applying it to climate change. This is a wonderful book, Climate Risk. If anyone wants to look at it afterwards, I'm happy to share. And I just wanted to share one short passage from Lauren's book. We've so far failed to take sufficient precautionary measures against climate change, but we must hope it's not too late to avert climate catastrophe. I hope for my son and for the billions who will live after him that it's not too late for us. All of us now and into the future to take our precautionary obligations seriously. We're living in a climate risk, but we're also living in a climate of hope. So she thinks we have very strong precautionary obligations to do stuff to avert climate catastrophe. That's kind of Hartzell-Nichols' view in a nutshell. Okay. Now, I gotta admit, in some of my other work over the years, I've been a little bit, I think the precautionary principle is better than the innocence it's proven harmful view. I've got some concerns about the precautionary principle too, that I'm happy to I'm not going to get into this now, but I'm happy to circle back to this in Q&A if anybody's interested. But there are other possibilities too that I would consider Carsonian. I think there's different ways of absorbing the lessons of Carsonian caution. And I want to talk just briefly about this careful experiment. So this is another remarkable book by a philosopher, Adam Briggle, who works at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. Briggle is an activist, and he joined in community activism to help bring about the first municipal fracking ban in the United States in Denton, Texas. And he just wrote this amazing book about it. I really recommend it. And he's more of an environmental pragmatist. His view is actually, I think, really moderate and really interesting, really like middle of the road. And I have a lot of sympathy for this kind of view. So Briggle says, what I have in mind is something closer to field experiments where we intervene in the world, we hoping our intentions will pan out, but also where the unintended things might happen. We call it an experiment, but it's good to keep in mind that all experiments are kind of gamble. So then this is the key question. What conditions must be in place to make real-world experiments reasonable and fair? And then he gives an account. So he's like, if you want to experiment with new technology, here are 3 things you got to do from a kind of pragmatist perspective. You gotta have informed consent. You can't inflict things on people without their informed consent. He fudges a little bit. He's like, at the very least, they must be compensated for any harms that occur. But I think and note that the continuity of Rachel Carson, the informed consent stuff is really important. There must be a robust system for monitoring and learning from the real world experiment. So you got to have a system set up before you experiment for monitoring the impacts. And then the experiment's got to be modifiable. You gotta be willing to say, oh, if your monitoring system is sending up red flags, you've got to be able to say, okay, we're going to stop. We're going to redo things. We're not, we're going to change things up. And Briggle says if those 3 conditions are not met, it's actually not okay to just rush ahead with new technology. And he applies this to hydraulic fracturing in his hometown. He says, look, at first he's really he's kind of reluctant to get on board with the fracking ban. He's not sure about the precautionary principle. But then as he kind of gets to understand the situation, he realizes that the fracking companies are violating all these conditions. So he's not like against fracking per se, but how are they doing this? How is the experiment going forward? Okay. So I think both of these views, whether you like a precautionary principle view or a more pragmatist, careful experiment view, I think both of these views imply pretty straightforwardly that the entire rollout of generative AI technology in the United States and beyond has been completely messed up. Like we kind of we've been kind of doing this wrong the whole time. Okay. So now to kind of wrap things up with work towards a Carsonian conclusion. I thought it would be interesting to mention in 2023, this is shortly after ChatGPT got widely released and AI just became the thing that everyone was focused on. There was a letter that got shared that was a really pretty strident call for caution. And I just want to read a bit from it. So AI systems with human competitive intelligence can pose profound risks to society and humanity, as shown by extensive research and acknowledged by top AI labs. Advanced AI could represent a profound change in the history of life on Earth and should be planned for and managed with commensurate care and resources. Unfortunately, this level of planning and management is not happening. Okay? So who's saying that? A bunch of tech people, including Elon Musk, who was one of the more famous signatories of the letter at the time. And they go further, they say, therefore, we call on all AI labs to immediately pause for at least 6 months the training of AI systems more powerful than ChatGPT-4. This pause should be public and verifiable and should include all key actors. If such a pause cannot be enacted quickly, governments should step in and institute a moratorium. That's pretty forceful and I think really, really interesting. And of course, none of that happens at all. So I just kind of wanted to mention how remarkable. When I was thinking about this, think about imagine the 1950s and a bunch of people working for chemical companies issued a letter like this. Maybe let's pause moratorium on using DDT. That's kind of hard to imagine that something like that is going to happen. I think here in the AI case. So to pull things together, I argue if we care at all about human well-being or the environment, then it's a pretty terrible idea to treat future developments. And I'm being very careful about my wording here. Future developments. The future developments in AI research that are not yet here to stay. Okay? It's a terrible idea to treat future developments in generative AI as innocent and self-proven harmful. I think this is just a lesson in Carson's work on pesticides. The innocent and self-proven harmful approach needs defending vis-a-vis the well-developed philosophical alternatives. We have decades of people working in environmental philosophy to develop other approaches to thinking about making policy decisions under conditions of massive uncertainty. We ought to take that work seriously. And it's actually, I think it's hard to find anybody actually who's upfront about this and actually will defend the kind of innocent and proven harmful approach. I think it's hard to do. And then finally, our entire discussion of the ethics of generative AI is taking place in a way that I think most often presupposes the innocent and proven harmful view, which I would just submit as a problem. My hope in trying to channel Rachel Carson as much as I can today, my hope is to really draw on her legacy to maybe suggest maybe we can learn from her about how to stage cognitive intervention. I think the situation we're in leaves me really uncomfortable, and I think there's work to do here. So, great. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy for a conversation. Mr. Venus, welcome too. I know people are all over the place on this topic. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ida, and I'm just kind of wondering on what your thoughts are on the AI icon initiative.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and I've actually talked. I was about to say I talked recently. It was earlier this semester. I talked with Matt Gardzina, who's our VP for Library of Information Tech, about this. And I've had some concerns along the way, but I am really reassured actually, and I'm kind of, I'm actually really grateful that he was cool with including this perspective as like part of the AI econ discussion. I thought it was like kind of offering to join in this conversation today, do a little philosophy. I also was really interested in making sure that a kind of environmental perspective was like a part of things as we go forward. Maybe this isn't the whole story, right? There's a lot more to talk about, but I feel a little reassured by his willingness to like include an environmental angle, as part of that conversation going forward. So that's the part of the answer. Yes, and I'm also grateful they're co-sponsoring, and so happy to have this discussion be a part of it. In that.
So how would you compare something like the sociological threats or impacts of AI versus the like energy conservation, that kind of threat?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question too. Like, this talk has been really narrowly focused on the climate change stuff and maybe the sci-fi environmental catastrophe stuff. I don't know. I'm so worried about, but this is more me just like expressing personal worries. I don't have well worked out views about any of this stuff, and I don't have as clear sense probably other people here do as like what we're actually talking about in the next 2 or 3 years. But the ways in which AI systems could kind of affect our interpersonal relationships are keeping me up at night. Like I think I'm actually in my heart. This is what I'm really worried about this. Yeah. Also, the banjo example was maybe a little like silly, but for me, like the big question about this generative AI stuff, what's it going to do to us? Like, how's it going to change us? All technology changes us. I'm worried about, we know like social media has changed us in ways that I've got questions. So what are we looking at there? Doug, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a kind of an example from my research on rivers that kind of talks about the experimental versus precautionary principle. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this. So in doing river restoration work, in what's called habitat improvement work, there are technologies that have been used that were referred to as experimental. And they were used, the same basic technology were used for over 50 years with very little actual data collection and testing of that technology. And in this case, I think the word experimental was used as a way for people doing the work to avoid any criticism, because it meant that, well, this was just, you were just trying to learn, right? And so, but there was never a real effort made to learn from the experiments. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, and the use of the term experimental as an excuse more than an actual effort.
Wow, yeah, that's really, I actually hadn't really thought about that possibility. And what I should add, if anybody looks at Adam Briggle's book, the word that he uses is, he talks about his view being kind of proactionary approach, which, I don't know what to make of that term. And it might also be subject to the same kind of like misuse that you're talking about with the term experimental, but just to kind of observe that that's the term that he likes. But he is also absolutely working in this pragmatist tradition. It goes back to like classical American pragmatist philosophy like John Dewey. And they often think of themselves as having a kind of experimentalist view of things. I'm gonna speculate. I mean, Briggle, I would imagine, would be pretty critical of the kind of scenario that you're talking about. He's gonna want to be looking at like whether those actual conditions for ethical experimentation are met, in particular cases. But, that's a really interesting case. I haven't thought about.
Yeah, I mean, that was just kind of making me think of how, like, even when you just type something in like a Google search and it gives you the AI overview, it has a little thing in the corner that's like, this generative AI is experimental, like, but it doesn't go on to explain like this is how we're trying to learn what it does. Just like this is experimental. So I feel like it's similar, like making a note of something by calling it experimental, but using that as maybe just an excuse for not knowing its full effects or even trying to know them. And I think this issue of like informed consent is really interesting because it's like we don't, like AI is often kind of pushed into our lives these days without us even like requesting it, and also because we don't know the full repercussions environmentally and otherwise, it's really difficult to just to know what you are signing up for. And I think I just I'm trying to formulate my questions here. I'm having a lot of pauses, but the like, what do you think informed consent would look like in this situation?
Really awesome question. And a really hard question, actually. That's really interesting. I think actually that's a major question for us to think about. One interesting thing that comes to mind here is like the difference, and I'm not sure how helpful this is, but the difference between opt-in versus opt-out systems, you know? So like currently, I'm thinking about like, Kate, what you observed about like, you know, Google searches automatically giving you AI generated results and stuff like that. That sets up like an opt-out system. And so like if you just do a Google search like you've always done, you know, all of a sudden now there's AI happening. There's, you know, AI installed, you know, phones and all this kind of stuff. So it really is more of like an opt-out situation right now where anyone who wants to avoid it has to make special effort. You gotta try. It takes work to actually, okay, if I want to do an internet search and I don't want AI results, how do I think about that? Contrast that with an opt-in where the default is no, you know, like it's not. You can have an opt-in system where like AI is still available for specialized uses, but you have to sign up to use it for those specialized things, you know, and it's not quite being foisted on us in the same way. So maybe just an initial suggestion would be the informed consent issue looks maybe a lot better if we're switching from an opt-out to an opt-in model. That's a real incomplete answer that maybe is the first thought. Yeah.
I'm just really interested by your discussion of AI and the technology itself, with the argument that it's just a neutral tool. Because to me, that seems like a very similar approach to how people are currently talking about guns in the US. So I guess I'm just wondering, would you say that's a fair comparison? And how can we avoid AI in the future becoming a politicized topic? Is there even any way to do that?
So to answer your second question, no, this is absolutely political. I actually have another quotation from Carson that I queued up on to share on this note. Your comparison with issues of guns and gun control, I think is actually really salient. I know I have to be really careful because what I'm about to say might be a little controversial, but you know the conservative response to a lot of arguments in favor of gun control and stronger gun regulations is often sort of bumper sticker form. Guns don't kill people. Right? This is everywhere. You hear this all the time. I actually think that reflects the same confused idea about technology that I'm criticizing here. It's that ethical inertness view. It's like the guns are not good or bad per se. It's just how you use them. Right? That's the view. And I just think that, I just disagree with that. I think that ignores the way in which the design of different kinds of technology shapes behaviors and provides affordances. And I think people who favor stronger gun regulations are pointing this out constantly, that the design of the guns actually really, really matters. You know, so I see these issues actually being really tightly connected. Yeah, very much, yeah. Thanks. two questions back here, maybe, Ryan?
What is your opinion on like the ecobots and the technology, the environmental technology that's coming from AI? Because I feel like while it can be very helpful, a big thing about people who work and like do environmental work and wildlife work is the empathy and the connection and the passion. And you're also talking about future AI. We don't know those developments, but where we're at right now, even though they can be very helpful, what do you think about that lack of emotional connection, the human connection?
Yeah, really, really interesting. I agree it's a problem. I mean, so with the ecobots, I don't actually know if anyone is really talking about like AI ecobots yet or anything, but there are definitely companies making like drones and stuff to go after, like, I'm gonna put it in scare quotes now, invasive species. I'm not a fan of that term, but yeah. I kind of agree with your thought that take like ecological restoration projects, right? If there's a restoration project and you find, oh, it might be kind of helpful, there's a company making tree bots. They're like they'll like climb up a tree and they'll do stuff and all this kind of thing. That's the thing. And like you might think, oh, well, maybe there's an application in the context of ecological restoration for like tree bots or something like that. And like, I don't know, maybe, but like restoration is about care. It's all, if anyone saw Laura J. Martin's talk last year on ecological restoration, where she compared restoration projects to gardening, it's about care, and like developing that relationship to a place. And so I do worry about how having more technological intermediaries, is that really contributing to like what restoration projects ought to be about? I'm not sure.
I was wondering, because you mentioned future developments in AI, if you think it would be worth reevaluating the AI that's like here to stay, as you put it, more or less, or it would be more prudent, I guess, to find ways to accept that and embrace it instead.
Yeah. Great. Giving a full answer to that question might require me tipping more of my hand. I have lots of concerns about the AI that we already have and like what it means. I have concerns about intellectual property issues. Lots of people are worried about that. I have concerns about like what it means for scholarly citation practices, like all kinds of stuff. And so I think there's like, I am worried. Well, this is okay. I'm gonna kind of couch my answer in Adam Briggle, like pragmatist inspired way. Okay, we actually have had some rollout of AI technology, right? So now that we've got it, we can kind of start to see, okay, is this good for us? Sometimes, in other places not. Like, is there some of this that makes sense, and maybe some things that don't? And if we were doing this in any kind of responsible, kind of pragmatist way, there'd be some assessment there. Like okay, let's take stock. Let's see. Let's look at like what we have now. Does this make sense to us, right? And then let's say, okay, do we want to rush ahead or not? And no one's doing that. No one's doing that, right? So that's a real concern. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think my question is related to this very last point. I'm wondering what you might think about a potential disanalogy between applying the environmental pragmatism approach to fracking and applying it to AI. Because you might think that that AI, as opposed to fracking, has more potential to shape our attitudes and values that's going to feed into the monitoring and assessing work. And I'm wondering whether you might think that would make trouble for the application of environmental pragmatism to AI. I mean, I'm generally sympathetic to the Briggle style middle road, but I do worry about like the fact that like, AI is also sort of like massively affecting our values at the same time that we're trying to assess ongoing risks.
Yeah.
And fracking's not doing that.
Yeah. Wow. Professor Crawford with the amazing question that I don't even know quite how to process. Like, it's such an interesting point that like because from a pragmatist perspective, when we pause to assess things, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, it means like, are we using this technology in a way that like makes any kind of sense with respect to like the values that we're really committed to, right? Well, what if the technology is changing our values as we go? Maybe that's such an interesting question. That introduces like such massive uncertainties. Like the adoption, it's almost like kind of, as I said earlier, I have some concerns about the precautionary approach too. That uncertainty kind of freaks me out so much. It kind of pushes me back towards maybe a more better safe and sorry kind of approach, to be honest. Like, because we're making ourselves here, you know. We're like, this is a humanity shaping thing that we're talking about. Yeah. Such an incredible question. Professor Feldman?
Thanks. I was thinking more about the guilty, what the phrase, innocent until proven harmful project, right? And so there's a way in which we can describe that principle in a way that is like so uncharitable that it's hard to conceive anyone would want to adopt that view about anything. But of course, like most things in the world we do, that is the principle we follow. Because like, you know, everything we put out in the world poses some risks. And we don't have a massive regulatory system that says, you know, you have to prove that everything is safe before you can say it or build it or do it, right? So then here's my question. I was wondering, like, what your thoughts are on sort of general principles for figuring out what the threshold of risk has to be, such that we don't find the innocent until proven harmful principle plausible. Right? So, because I mean, in your example, you're like, well, there's a small risk of global catastrophe, but that could be true for like someone writing a novel, or you know, like there are all sorts of things that have that feature. So, what is it? Like, how do we know that in this situation we're at the threshold where that sort of risky default position is definitely the wrong position?
So, if I could add like one more thing on the innocent until proven guilty stuff, there is a worry. So you can point to cases where we gambled with technology and everything was okay, mostly okay. So I think about like genetically modified foods, for example. Now, I have lots of problems with the larger industrial agricultural system within which GMOs are now like a fully integrated part. There's a lot of stuff to say about that. But in terms of like human health impacts, we've all been consuming, genetically modified foods for years and years and years and years, but without any evidence that there's real negative health impacts, it seems safe. So you can look at those kind of cases where, yeah, that was an innocent until proven harmful case, and kind of got lucky. There is an interesting meta question. Maybe this is what you're doing, and actually, I don't know how to approach this, but if you think of what I said about FDA drug approval, you might think, well, in some contexts, we want to take a precautionary approach. In some other contexts, maybe where the stakes are lower or whatever, in innocent until proven harmful approach is just fine. It's not such a problem. Maybe in other cases, we want to insist on rigorous criteria for ethical experimentation. Okay, then there's a meta problem. Like, how do we figure out like which of these three views about technology to adopt, right? Like in a particular case. And I don't really, you need argument. I think some sort of arguments are needed. I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. But I think maybe I'll kind of circle back here to like the main thing I want to say, which is that in the generative AI discussion, I think there's a really broad assumption of this innocence until proven harmful view, and like nobody's trying, nobody's shouldering that group of arguments. I think if anyone wants to defend that view, that's a project, that somebody has to take on. But I do agree that there might be plenty of cases where like plenty of other contexts can be where you might be able to defend this.
It's just a thought, and like just to add to that, but like in the environmental health field, we generally use like
risk versus exposure, right? But to bring up like what Kate and Derek were talking about earlier, like if you don't have an opt-out or opt-in system, like then you're not getting to control the exposure. And so that's one of the things that was just like so interesting to me. And also everybody's individual preference is very different in risk tolerance, you know, like it's, you know, so it's not like you can just go to an epidemiologist and say, hey, figure this out for me, like just more questions.
This is really interesting too. Well, like one lesson from COVID, right, is there's a lot of variation with respect to different people's risk tolerance. And so from a larger policy question, then you got to ask, well, okay, given that variation, like what kind of approach to new technology makes sense in a sort of democratic society like we hope we'll have. Professor Rosa, yeah.
Thanks for the talk. So I just want a couple of thoughts that people kind of push out, and we've had conversations about the ethics. Where does it come in, the ethical building of the technology? Because we've talked a little bit about how AI is built and maybe a little bit of the theft that occurs there. But pointing back to, you mentioned the data center in Waterford, and something that struck me when I was reading up on it, there was an assertion of some people saying, well, why mess up our pristine Waterford? Why don't we just build it in Overton in London? They already have all these open factories that you can just take over. So it's very easy for people to kind of make that leap of, let those, you know, that handle. So that's one aspect of environmental justice, but this idea of how is the technology built ethically? And if the answer is yes or no, then does that mean it's no longer a non-biased?
Awesome. Thank, those are both really, really fabulous points. So, you know, you point out that like the data center siting decisions really raise all the traditional questions about NIMBY, not in my backyard activism, the topic that Professor Feldman and I thought about, and yeah, like if the local opposition to these data centers is just saying, oh, we want the data center, just not here. Well, that's kind of like, you know. So that's a really. You can also imagine local activists saying, we don't want the data center here, we don't want them anywhere. That's a bit of a different view. I think you get a lot of like really interesting and complicated questions about environmental justice. Like absolutely, yeah. Which has to be part of all of this. I'll tip my hand a little bit more. Yeah, I'm concerned about intellectual property issues. There's this recently, I think the Atlantic shared like an app where you can, you know, kind of type your name in and figure out how many of your publications Meta used to train up their AI systems. I typed my name in. It was like 18 of my publications used without my permission to train AI. You know, and like that's like it's a real concern. It's like the whole thing is predicated on massive intellectual property theft. You know, and companies that are doing this pretty much with impunity. There's a couple of lawsuits here and there, but like, yeah. And so like you might, from an ethical perspective, yeah, absolutely. Like if there's like an ethical problem, it's like baked in, then yeah, that's a real issue for all the technology. Okay.
I wonder what your thoughts are. I have also like been weighing the intellectual property dynamics, like that is a super important issue. But then you think about the accessibility of technology and how like we're having this wonderful discussion right here in Connecticut College, but there's so many people who can't go to Connecticut College, and AI is free online. Anyone can do it anywhere, and so it's making this massive amount of information accessible to populations that didn't have access to it before. And do you think that outweighs any of the negatives we're talking about, or if there are any other ways that information can be more accessible if AI is a prominent one right now?
Yeah, awesome. So, like, yes to accessibility. So, like some of you probably know, I'm a huge like proselytizer for open educational resources. I like really believe in it, and believe in like open access publishing. And so I think that's super important. the kind of hiding of academic research behind paywalls is a real problem. And so I do agree like 150% that we ought to be sort of all in on improving that. AI does seem more accessible, but your question makes me think another issue, which is like, just a kind of epistemic worry about the reliability of the information that people are getting from AI. Like, AI generated content is widely accessible, but how great is like, is that the same thing as making information more widely accessible? Right, that's not super clear. Yeah, I think that's a whole other kind of like can of worms. Questions? Yeah, sure.
One thing I was wondering is what you think about who's responsible for like kind of keeping everything in check. Because I was thinking about how the researchers who actually like created the technology behind ChatGPT in 2017, it was for the purposes of like translating English to German, like increasing that accuracy. And I don't know if we would have seen it become what it is today. And like researchers, I guess, are more concerned with like creating new knowledge in their small like niche field rather than like having the same legislation or like safety testing. And it's more so like the big tech companies are kind of using it widely in search of like profit without all those concerns.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think I think that I kind of share that worry that it's not helpful to talk about like holding particular researchers responsible. I also think about this on the consumer side. I'm not sure that like holding particular users responsible is really the way to go. By the way, there's a big discussion just in general among environmentalists about like how to think about exactly these kind of issues of responsibility. And there's been a recent move away from focusing too much on the particular people's spending decisions and stuff like that. I think the thing I worry about, like I think what you really want is like political institutions that can, that are legitimate and that can take, public inputs and like channel them into some sort of reasonable, reasonable policy constraints on the technology and stuff like that. And I just worry about a kind of a lag that we see. Like even if the political situation in the United States were a little bit better, our political institutions are not designed to like respond to these kind of really, really rapid technological developments. I mean, it's just so hard to like get up to speed. The technology is changing so fast. And so I'm really, this is just kind of a big political background concern is that we just don't have, like the responsible party ought to be like political institutions. And our political institutions are just kind of like not up to speed. I think is one way to address it. Oh, yes, maybe things are winding down a little bit. There is a reception outside, if anybody wants to hang out and talk over there. Yeah, thanks everybody.